Polls.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And we thank you for being here, Barnaby.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into something truly fascinating today. Something many people have heard about, maybe even experienced, but often find hard to define. We're talking about the awakening experience. And look, we're not talking about just, having a really good day or a sudden insight into a problem. This is different.
Much deeper, yeah.
We mean those temporary, but often completely life-altering shifts in how you perceive everything. Moments that can totally redefine reality for the person going through them.
Yeah, a fundamental shift.
So our mission today is really to try and get behind the mystery a bit. We're looking closely at the work of psychologist Steve Taylor. He spent, over 15 years researching this?
That's right, a long-term study.
Trying to scientifically map out what actually causes these incredible states and, maybe more importantly, why they matter so much for how we understand consciousness itself.
Exactly. The aim is to take this idea of awakening from something purely, let's say, mystical or esoteric.
Right.
And bring it into the realm of psychology, something we can actually observe and, analyze, even if these are rare events for many people.
Okay, so to really get a handle on what we mean, maybe we should start with the author's own experience. That kind of sets the stage, doesn't it?
It does. It's a really vivid description. He talks about just walking, doing something completely ordinary, walking in a valley, looking at fields, the sky, stuff he's seen 1,000 times.
And then suddenly, bam, like a switch flips. Not gradual at all.
No, instantaneous. And everything around him becomes, as he puts it, intensely real.
Intensely real. What does that even feel like?
Well, that intensity seems key. It's not just like putting on sharper glasses, He said the trees, the clouds, just the normal surroundings. They suddenly appeared more vivid, more intricate and beautiful.
Wow.
Like seeing the detail and the presence of everything in a way he never had before. But, and this is crucial, it wasn't just his vision that changed.
Right, it was internal too. He describes this huge flood of positive feeling, like an intense glow of well-being. And that core feeling of unity.
Connection.
Exactly, connection. He felt completely connected to everything around him. Like the boundary between him and the valley just dissolved.
Yeah.
He perceived that whatever was inside his own mind, his consciousness, was somehow also present out there.
In the trees, the clouds, everywhere.
Yes. Which leads us nicely to the definition the research uses.
Yeah.
An awakening experience is defined as a temporary but really dramatic expansion and intensification of awareness.
Expansion and intensification. Okay.
It fundamentally transforms how perception works. It's like a structural shift. The usual filter we have, the one that makes reality manageable but maybe a bit dull, it just lifts for a moment.
And that's where the research comes in, treating these incredibly subjective moments as actual data.
Precisely. It's empirical. Looking at hundreds of accounts to find the common ground, the common triggers, the common effects, which is fascinating because you hear these stories and they sound so mystical, so personal, maybe even, spiritual. But here we have psychology trying to study them systematically.
Yeah, moving them away from just being random, mysterious anomalies into something we can potentially categorize and maybe even explain, at least partly.
Which naturally leads to the big question Taylor's research tackled. If these are structural shifts, what actually pulls the trigger? What causes them to happen in ordinary people?
And the answers they found, they're really quite surprising, especially the most common one.
Okay, let's get into that. The triggers.
So when they analyzed all the data, hundreds of experiences, the causes seemed to fall into 3 main buckets. But the biggest bucket, the most frequent trigger, it's probably the last thing most people would expect.
Right. This is the counterintuitive one. We're talking about psychological distress.
Exactly. Intense psychological distress. This accounts for roughly 1/3 of all the experiences documented in their sample.
1/3. That's huge. And it just goes against everything you'd assume, doesn't it?
Yeah. It really does. I mean, think about it. Severe stress, clinical depression, maybe grief after a profound loss. We normally think of these states as the absolute opposite of bliss or cosmic connection or higher consciousness.
Yeah, there's states you want to get out of, not states you expect to lead to some kind of revelation.
Yet, the data strongly suggests that this kind of intense inner turmoil is quite often the very thing that kind of blasts open the door to this radical expansion of awareness and peace.
Okay, how does that work? There must be a mechanism. The research gives an example, right?
It does. There's an anecdote about a man going through just terrible inner conflict. He was deeply confused about his sexuality, and this confusion was directly leading to the collapse of his marriage.
So unimaginable stress, his whole world, his identity, probably felt like he was falling apart.
Completely a state of psychological crisis. And it was right in the middle of that turbulence, that chaos that the experience happened.
What did he describe?
He described a moment where all that internal struggle, the confusion, the pain, it just stopped. Everything just ceased to be.
Ceased to be. Wow.
In that sudden emptiness, he said he lost all sense of time passing, and critically, lost all sense of himself as a separate me.
The ego dissolved.
Seems like it. He reported feeling totally at one with nature, and despite the crisis he was objectively in, feeling this massive sense of peace.
A massive sense of peace amid total turmoil. How do we explain that psychologically? What's the source saying is happening there?
Well, the interpretation revolves around that dissolution of the me you just mentioned. You know, we spend our whole lives constructing and defending our ego, our story, our identity, who we think we are, our problems, our goals.
Right, it's our operating system.
It is. But when distress becomes so overwhelming, so intense, that those familiar mental structures, the ego's defenses, just can't contain the conflict anymore. They can shatter. Temporarily.
So the system breaks down under the pressure.
Exactly. The extreme turbulence essentially forces the mind into a kind of surrender. Now, usually that breakdown is just distressing, maybe leads to worse psychological states. But occasionally, according to this research, that temporary surrender, that shattering of the ego, removes the very filter that defines the self as separate from the world.
Ah, okay. So the conflict paradoxically leads to the loss of the self that's in conflict.
Precisely. And that loss of the separate, conflicted self is what brings about the unexpected peace and oneness. It's like the core conflict requires a self to exist, and when that self temporarily dissolves, the conflict vanishes with it.
It's like an involuntary reboot, almost. A very extreme one.
You could almost see it as a kind of psychological safety valve, perhaps. When the normal ways of coping are completely overwhelmed, the system shifts into this entirely different mode of perception.
Okay, but hang on. We need to be really careful here, don't we? This raises a kind of ethical point for anyone listening. If intense suffering is the most common trigger, are we suggesting people should, I don't know, seek out trauma? That sounds incredibly dangerous.
That is such an important point to clarify. Absolutely not. The research is purely descriptive. It's saying, this is what we observed. It's not prescriptive. It's not saying, this is a good way to achieve awakening.
Right, correlation, not causation in terms of a method.
Exactly. We're just noting a surprising correlation. Sometimes, intense psychological breakdown can accidentally clear the decks enough for this kind of experience to emerge. It is absolutely not suggesting suffering is a healthy or desirable path.
Okay.
In fact, for most people experiencing that level of distress, the outcome is simply more distress, maybe even illness. These awakening experiences arising from turmoil are the exception, not the rule. It's observing a rare instance where destruction, paradoxically, leads to a moment of transcendence. It's not a recipe.
Okay, that's crystal clear.
Yeah.
So distress is number one, surprisingly. What's the second major trigger? This one feels a bit more intuitive, maybe.
Yes, much more so. The second most common trigger is contact with nature.
Ah, okay. That makes sense.
This accounts for about a quarter of the experiences documented. It's the sort of thing poets have written about for centuries.
Right. You think of huge mountains, endless forests, the ocean. These places naturally seem to quiet the mind or inspire awe or make your own problems feel small.
That's precisely the idea. The environment itself seems to do a lot of the work in silencing that internal chatter. The source mentions an anecdote of a woman swimming in a lake.
Okay.
She described feeling completely alone, but part of everything. A sense of harmony washed over her, and she said, all my troubles disappeared.
Wow. Just like that.
It seems the sheer scale, the beauty, the stillness, the sort of indifference of nature, it naturally diminishes the importance we place on our own temporary, self-centered worries and dramas.
And you mentioned poets. The research connects this to historical figures, too.
It does. It notes people like the Romantic poets Wordsworth, Shelley, Coleridge. They actively sought out sublime natural landscapes. They seem to understand, intuitively, that confronting the massive, impersonal beauty of the natural world was a way to escape the narrow confines of the everyday, rational, ego-bound mind.
So they didn't necessarily need formal meditation. They had the Alps or the Lake District.
Exactly. They were deliberately seeking that feeling of being small in the face of something vast. And that feeling, paradoxically, can be incredibly liberating. Nature offers this huge, non-judgmental space where those ego boundaries can just gently soften and blur.
Instead of being shattered by crisis, like in the first trigger.
Precisely. It's a gentler pathway to a similar kind of boundary dissolution.
Okay, so distress, nature.
Yeah.
What's the third major category?
The third one, appearing in roughly similar numbers to the nature trigger, is intentional spiritual practice.
Ah, okay. This is the one people might most readily associate with these states.
Probably. This primarily means meditation, the deliberate practice of cultivating inner quietness and awareness. But it also includes things like sustained prayer, deep contemplation, or certain psychophysical practices.
Like yoga or Tai Chi.
Exactly. Practices like yoga or Tai Chi, where there's a focus on body awareness, breath, and a quieting of the mind.
So if you look at all three triggers, intense distress, being in nature, and spiritual practice, is there a common thread? What links them?
That's the key insight, really. The common denominator seems to be the temporary interruption or cessation of the normal, habitual, ego-driven stream of thought, that constant mental chatter that filters our experience.
So whether the ego is sort of knocked offline by crisis, or gently quieted by the vastness of nature,
Yep.
or deliberately silenced through focused practice like meditation, the end result is similar. The usual mental processing pauses.
Exactly. The system pauses, the filter drops, and this different, perhaps more fundamental mode of awareness emerges. That synthesis, linking these seemingly disparate triggers, is really central to the research's findings.
Okay. Now, before we dive into how this happens in the brain or mind, the researcher made a specific point about something often linked to altered states. Psychedelics.
Ah, yes. That's an important clarification in this study.
What was the finding there? Are they a major trigger or not?
According to this research, drawing samples from the general population, psychedelics were not found to be a major trigger of what they define as genuine awakening experiences.
Okay, but there's a caveat there. Right?
There is. First, it could simply be sample bias. Far fewer people in the general population, especially when this research began, had used psychedelics compared to the number who've experienced stress or spent time in nature, so they might be underrepresented.
Sure, that makes sense. But there was a more fundamental distinction being made, wasn't there, about the quality of the experience?
Absolutely. This is the crucial point. The research suggests that even when psychedelics do induce altered states, those states often manifest as perceptual distortions. Things looking weird, colors changing, patterns emerging.
Hallucinations, maybe?
Or hallucinations, yes. Or sometimes a state of dissociation, feeling disconnected from reality or oneself.
Okay.
And the argument is that these kinds of experiences, while perhaps interesting or intense, often lack the specific core features of a genuine awakening.
Which are? Remind us again.
That intense sense of reality being heightened, not distorted. That feeling of profound unity and connection, not dissociation. And that deep inherent sense of well-being and peace.
Ah, okay. That's a really important distinction for anyone listening. An altered state isn't necessarily the same as what this research calls a higher state or an awakening.
Exactly. If the defining characteristic awakening is this feeling of seeing reality more clearly, more intensely, more unified than usual, then merely distorting perception, making walls breathe or whatever, isn't the same thing.
You might even be adding another layer of mental noise rather than removing the usual filters.
That's one way to look at it. If the idea is that there's an underlying reality that's unified and peaceful, and the goal is to perceive that, then simply introducing sensory or cognitive distortions might be taking you further away, in a sense, even if the experience feels profound at the time. It lacks that specific revelatory quality about the nature of reality itself.
Got it. So that brings us neatly to the next big question. The debate over causes. We know the triggers: distress, nature, practice. But how do these triggers actually generate the experience? Is it a brain thing, a mind thing?
This is where it gets complex and where different scientific fields offer different perspectives. We can broadly look at neurological theories focusing on brain structures and psychological theories focusing on mental processes.
Okay, let's start with the brain hardware. What are the neurological ideas? One involves the temporal lobes, right?
Yes, the temporal lobes. These are really crucial parts of the brain, tucked away on the sides, involved in memory, understanding language, processing emotions, complex visual perception, a real hub of activity.
So what's the theory?
The theory, put simply, is that unusual activity, perhaps overstimulation in the temporal lobes, might be the direct cause of these profound feelings, the sense of deep meaning, revelation, maybe even the altered sense of self.
And is there evidence for this?
Well, some support comes from reports from a small number of people who have temporal lobe epilepsy. Some individuals report experiencing states that sound somewhat similar to mystical or awakening experiences, sometimes coinciding with seizure activity.
Okay, so a specific brain region potentially firing abnormally. That's one idea. What's the other main neurological theory?
Yeah.
It relates to that feeling of oneness, right? The boundary dissolving.
Exactly. This theory focuses on a different part of the brain, the superior posterior parietal cortex.
Okay, that's a mouthful. What does that part do?
Its job is largely about spatial awareness and navigation. It helps us figure out where our body is in space, where objects are relative to us. Essentially, it helps draw the line between me and not me, physically speaking. It's kind of the brain's boundary setter.
I see. So the theory is,
The theory proposes that during experiences of oneness, connection, or ego dissolution, where that boundary feels like it disappears, this specific brain region, the posterior parietal cortex, is significantly less active than normal.
so if the part of the brain responsible for sensing boundaries powers down temporarily,
Then the experience of boundaries dissolves, leading to that feeling of unity with the external world.
okay, both of those theories sound plausible, right? They offer concrete physical locations in the brain for these very abstract sounding experiences. Feels scientific.
They are definitely appealing for that reason. They seem to anchor the experience in the physical structure of the brain, the hardware. But, and this is a big but, we need to look critically at the wider evidence and the critiques from other neuroscientists.
Okay, so let's connect the dots. What are the problems with these neurological theories?
Well, several significant issues have been raised. Firstly, some of the key studies underpinning these theories have been criticized for methodological flaws like a lack of proper control groups.
Right, that's fundamental in science.
It is. And perhaps even more significantly, other research teams have had difficulty replicating the findings consistently.
And in the neuroscience, if you can't reliably replicate a finding linking a specific brain area to a specific experience, that's a major red flag, isn't it?
It's a huge problem. It suggests the initial finding might have been due to chance, or maybe specific characteristics of the small group studied, or some other artifact.
Exactly.
If the connection was robust, it should show up reliably across different studies and different groups of people.
Okay. What about the specific evidence, like the temporal lobe epilepsy connection? You said it was only some patients.
Exactly. The data there is actually quite messy. While a few individuals with temporal lobe epilepsy do report mystical-like states, the source material we're drawing on emphasizes that it's far more common for people with this condition to experience negative states during or around seizures.
Like what?
Intense anxiety, overwhelming fear, disorientation, confusion, sometimes feelings of dread. Basically the polar opposite of the peaceful unity and well-being that characterizes the awakening experiences we're discussing.
That really undermines the idea that temporal lobe activity is the direct cause of positive awakening, doesn't it? If it were, you'd expect a more consistent positive experience.
You certainly would. Other studies looking specifically for links between seizures and higher states have found no connection at all, so the link is tenuous at best.
And what about the parietal cortex theory, the boundary setter?
That's also been disputed. Other neuroscientists argue that pinning the complex sense of self and spatial awareness down to reduced activity in just that one specific spot is an oversimplification. Brain functions, especially something as complex as self-awareness, tend to be distributed across networks, not isolated to single points.
So the specific anatomical claims are debatable within the neuroscience community itself.
They are. It's proven difficult to reliably confirm that reduced activity in only that region directly equates to the feeling of ego dissolution in a consistent way.
Okay, so if the purely hardware explanations locating it in specific brain parts are facing these challenges, maybe we should shift focus. Look at the psychological explanations, more like the mind's software.
I think that's a really fruitful way to look at it. Shifting to psychological explanations allows us to think about the function state of the mind rather than just where the activity is happening. And crucially, it might offer a way to unify those three different triggers we talked about: distress, nature, and practice.
How so? What's the main psychological idea?
One key concept is what we could call the energy conservation hypothesis. This links awakening experiences primarily to states of deep relaxation and, importantly, mental quietness.
Mental quietness. Okay. How does that lead to intense reality?
Let's try an analogy. Think of your mind, your awareness, as being like a flashlight beam. Normally, that beam is constantly darting around, focusing on potential threats, planning the next step, replaying conversations, worrying. It's very busy.
By the internal chatter.
Exactly. And that busyness consumes a lot of mental energy. Our brains are actually designed to be efficient. To save energy, our awareness tends to automatically switch off or ignore things that are familiar or seem unimportant for immediate survival.
Like habituation. We stop noticing the ticking clock or the feeling of our clothes.
Precisely. We habituate to the mundane world around us. We stop truly seeing the intricate details of a leaf or hearing the richness of sound because our energy is needed for that internal chatter, the analysis, the planning, the worrying.
Okay, so we're usually running in a kind of low-power, energy-saving mode regarding pure perception.
You could say that. Now, according to this hypothesis, what happens when you enter a state of profound inner quietness? Maybe through deep meditation, or maybe you're just completely captivated by the stillness of a beautiful natural scene.
Your mind isn't doing all that usual busy work. Less internal chatter, less planning, less worrying.
Exactly. You're expending far less mental energy on those typical self-centered filtering processes. But that mental energy doesn't just vanish.
Okay. So where does it go?
The hypothesis suggests it gets redistributed. The energy that's not being used for internal chatter gets channeled into and intensifies the awareness that is active, namely your direct perception of the present moment.
So the flashlight beam stops darting around and becomes much brighter. Focus on what's right here, right now.
That's a great way to put it. That focused, amplified awareness makes the world suddenly appear incredibly vivid, intricate, drenched in significance, profoundly real. Because, the theory suggests, the world is always that vivid and intricate. We just usually run this powerful internal filter that dulls it down for efficiency.
Okay, that makes perfect sense for explaining the triggers involving spiritual practice and contact with nature. Both of those are paths towards mental quietness, reducing the chatter.
Yes, it provides a neat mechanism for those two.
But we still have the big one, the most common trigger: psychological turmoil. How does the energy conservation hypothesis account for awakening happening amidst intense stress and chaos? That doesn't sound like mental quietness at all.
You're right, it doesn't seem to fit that model directly. That requires bringing in a complementary psychological idea, sometimes called the deconstruction hypothesis. This looks specifically at the functional impact of shock, severe loss, or crisis.
Okay, deconstruction. What's being deconstructed?
Our normal psychological structures. Think about what happens during a profound shock. Maybe a sudden bereavement, a terrifying accident, a complete collapse of your life circumstances.
Everything you thought was stable is suddenly gone. Your assumptions, your sense of control, maybe even your identity feels shattered.
Exactly. There's a forced, often violent, temporary shutdown or deconstruction of normal psychological processes. The usual ways the mind organizes reality, the established sense of self, the routine filters, they are momentarily overwhelmed and broken down by the sheer intensity of the event.
The foundations crumble.
They do. And while this is almost always deeply distressing and can lead to psychological harm, occasionally this catastrophic breakdown creates a kind of opening, a fleeting window.
Ow.
Because the ego, the structure that normally maintains the filters and the sense of separateness, having been shattered or having nothing stable left to hold on to, it might briefly just stop functioning in its usual way. It's too overwhelmed to maintain the partitions.
So the filter system crashes, basically, due to overload.
In a sense, yes. And that temporary dissolution of the normal ego structure, forced by the shock, can inadvertently allow for a transcendence of familiar modes of perception. The filtering mechanism is briefly offline.
And that's when the underlying reality floods in. The oneness, the peace, the intensity.
That's the idea. The individual, despite being in the midst of crisis, briefly glimpses this other state, peace, unity, intense reality, precisely because the usual mental machinery that filters it out has temporarily broken down.
Wow. So the psychological approach seems to offer this unified framework then. Whether the ego's filtering activities dissolve violently by distress or gently quieted by nature or meditation, the result is a similar lifting of the veil, a release from filter perception.
That's the compelling aspect of the psychological explanations. They seem to account for all three major trigger types through these functional mechanisms of energy redistribution or structural deconstruction.
Okay, this is fascinating. Now let's get to the really big question, maybe. Why do people who have these experiences, and researchers like Taylor, consider them higher states of consciousness? What makes them higher than normal?
Yeah, that's a crucial point. Why not just call them different states?
Right.
They're generally considered higher because of the profound insight they seem to offer into the very nature of reality and perception itself. The core lesson, according to the research and the reports of those who experience them, is that our normal, everyday state of consciousness,
The one we assume is objective and complete.
is actually inherently limited and filtered.
Oh. So we're usually operating with blinkers on.
Kind of. We spend most of our lives, as Taylor puts it, trapped in a familiarized automatic perception of the world. We're running on those cognitive shortcuts, the habituation you mentioned, the energy-saving filters designed for survival and efficiency, not necessarily for perceiving the deepest truth or beauty of existence.
We see the simplified map, not the territory itself.
That's a great way to phrase it. The awakening experience feels like it rips the map away and shows you the territory unfiltered for the first time. That's why it carries such an incredibly strong sense of revelation.
It feels like truth, not just a different feeling.
Exactly. The deep certainty reported by people isn't usually, I had a weird hallucination. It's, I finally saw things as they really are. It reveals, or feels like it reveals, a wider and deeper reality that's normally hidden by our own minds, by the ego's need to categorize, simplify, and protect itself. It's like a glimpse behind the curtain.
Okay, that explains the higher designation. It feels more real, more fundamental. But these experiences, they don't usually last, do they? The research says they're typically quite brief.
That's right. Most last only a few moments, maybe minutes, sometimes extending to a few hours. It's rare for them to last much longer than a day in this sudden, intense form.
So if they're so brief, why are they so significant? What's the lasting impact?
Ah, the after effects. This is where their true importance lies. Even a momentary glimpse seems capable of leaving an indelible mark.
Yeah.
It's not just filed away as a strange memory or a weird anecdote. Many participants in Taylor's research described their awakening experience, however brief, as the single most significant and transformative moment of their entire lives.
Wow. More significant than getting married? Or career success? Or having children?
For many, yes. It fundamentally reoriented their understanding of themselves and the world.
That's a huge claim. What kind of changes are we talking about? Does it just make them happier?
It often leads to increased well-being, yes, but it seems to go deeper than just mood. Research Taylor conducted with a colleague, Christina Ejidosabo, specifically looked at the long-term after effects. They studied 90 detailed accounts.
And what did they find? What was the most significant change?
The most common and significant long-term effect was a profound positive shift in the person's fundamental orientation towards life.
Okay, break that down. What does that mean specifically?
Specifically, they measured significant increases in things like trust in life itself, a greater sense of confidence in their ability to handle whatever comes their way, and a more pervasive foundational sense of optimism.
Trust in life. That's interesting. Where does that come from?
Well, think about what underlies a lack of trust in life. It's usually fear, isn't it? Fear of randomness, fear of suffering, fear that things are fundamentally chaotic or meaningless or dangerous.
Right. The ego trying to control things because it's scared.
Exactly. So if you've had an experience, even a brief one, where you felt an underlying unity, a fundamental peace, a sense that reality at its core is okay or even benevolent,
Then the basis for that fundamental fear gets weakened. The everyday anxieties seem less ultimate.
precisely. The core assumption about the nature of reality shifts from potentially hostile or chaotic to fundamentally peaceful or trustworthy. It provides this deep inner existential reassurance. It doesn't mean life won't have challenges, but the background feeling changes.
There's that quote you mentioned earlier from one of the participants.
Yes, it captures it perfectly. To know that it's there, or here, I should say, is a great liberation.
That it being that deeper reality, that state of peace and unity, just knowing it exists, even if you're not in it right now, is liberating.
Exactly. It provides a permanent reference point outside the usual struggles of the ego. It changes your relationship with your own thoughts and fears. If you know deep down that reality is fundamentally okay, you're less likely to be completely consumed by the ego's anxieties.
It must change how you make decisions, how you approach relationships, how you handle failure, if your baseline has shifted from fear to trust.
It often does. It fosters a sense of perspective. It's like, watching a tense movie, but you've already been told the ending is happy. You can still feel the suspense in the moment, but that underlying dread isn't there. That foundational trust, that memory of reality being wider and deeper than the small, fearful self that seems to be the enduring gift of the experience.
Okay, so we've covered the triggers, distress, nature, practice. We've looked at the potential mechanisms, neurological debates, but strong psychological theories around energy and deconstruction. And we've seen the profound, lasting positive effects. Which brings us to the practical question for you listening. Can we actually do anything to have one of these experiences? Can we make them happen?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the research suggests we need to be careful with the word make. It would probably be an overstatement, based on the evidence, to claim we can strictly induce an awakening experience on demand, like flipping a switch.
There's still an element to spontaneity, or maybe readiness.
Yes, maybe grace, or accident, or things just aligning perfectly. There seems to be an element that's beyond deliberate control. However,
There's a however.
there's a big however,
Yeah.
the data is very clear on this. While we might not be able to force it, we can absolutely cultivate the conditions that make awakening experiences significantly more likely to occur.
Okay. And how do we do that based on the triggers we discussed?
Exactly. Since a huge proportion of these experiences are linked either to that gentle dissolution of the ego found in nature or the deliberate quieting of the mind in spiritual practice.
The path seems clear.
The actionable insight is pretty straightforward. We need to intentionally, deliberately cultivate a still and relaxed state of mind more often in our lives.
Reduce the mental chatter, reduce the energy spent on the ego's constant calculations and anxieties.
Precisely. Whether that takes the form of a consistent daily meditation practice, learning to observe thoughts without judgment, quieting the inner monologue, or whether it means making a real effort to regularly spend quiet, immersive time in nature, unplugged, just being present.
Like the woman swimming in the lake.
Just like her, both paths work towards the same end. They reduce the dominance of the filtering ego, they quiet the mind, and they create the psychological space where that energy conservation mechanism can kick in, potentially allowing awareness to intensify and expand.
So it's about optimizing the conditions, increasing the probability, rather than guaranteeing the result.
I think that's the most accurate way to put it. By consciously seeking stillness, by practicing presence, we're essentially building and strengthening the psychological pathways that seem to lead towards these experiences. We're making ourselves more receptive to glimpsing that wider, deeper reality that the research suggests is always there, just usually hidden behind our habitual filters.
What an incredible journey through this research. So, just to recap for everyone, we started by defining these awakening experiences temporary but profound shifts. Then we explored the three main triggers identified by the research.
Yes, the really surprising link with psychological distress, alongside the more intuitive triggers of contact with nature and dedicated spiritual practice like meditation.
And we unpacked the psychological theories that seem to best explain how these triggers work. The energy conservation idea, where mental quietness frees up energy to intensify perception.
And the deconstruction hypothesis, explaining how severe crisis can sometimes temporarily shatter the ego's filters, leading to an unexpected breakthrough.
And crucially, we talked about why these states are often called higher, because they feel like a revelation of a truer, less filtered reality, and the lasting impact. Not just a nice memory, but often a permanent, positive shift in trust, confidence, and optimism, stemming from that glimpse behind the curtain.
A liberation, as that one participant put it, knowing that deeper reality is always accessible, even when we're caught up in daily life.
Which leaves us, and you listening, with a really provocative final thought to mull over, doesn't it?
I think so. If this research is pointing towards the idea that our normal, everyday perception is inherently limited, fundamentally filtered for survival,
Right.
then it raises a fascinating question. What familiar parts of your daily life, maybe your strongly held opinions, your assumptions about how objective you are, the reliability of your chronic worries, the absolute importance you place on small conflicts, what parts of that might instantly shift or seem less solid if you, just for a moment, glimpsed that wider and deeper reality that lies beyond the filter?
That's definitely something to sit with, something to consider perhaps as you maybe try to cultivate a few more moments of stillness and peace in your week ahead.